So in this lesson, I'm going to go through some of the social and ethical components of STEM subjects. So STEM being science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We do a subject called iSTEM, which is, for, I guess the I is for information. That was a course created by a school near Newcastle, and it's now being widely adopted across New South Wales. What I want to do is have some lessons to talk about not so much the technology side, but more the implications of these fields. Now, the first, I have a range of topics I'm going to talk about in these sets of lessons. The first one is automation and wealth inequality. The next lesson is on, I have a couple of topics here, but the next one I usually talk is about the control problem. So the control problem is about, in the long term, where artificial general intelligence might lead us and why it's worth thinking about that now. I'll also do things on encryption, so that's the should all locks have keys. And I will do another lesson on, I'll do another lesson at least on biomedical engineering and innovations. So there's a few other topics there that I can look at, so things like CRISPR and Simpson's paradox and a few other mathematical things on encryption, but also also on game theory. So that's my fourth lesson, is game theory, where we talk about things like the prisoner's dilemma. So just to get started, we're going to talk about the two concepts that are in this first topic. So it's automation, and the second part is wealth inequality. Okay. So, first of all, can I get someone, you guys are a smart class, can someone tell me what automation is? Go.
Machines.
Automations are machines, yeah, that's pretty true, that's a general term. More recently, when we talk about automation in a social concept, what we're usually talking about now is the idea of the increasing rate that machines are doing more work for humans, and how automation could start to be replacing different kinds of labour in the workforce. Now, this has been happening for a long time. One of the best videos on automation is a video by a guy called C.G.P. Gray, I'll just close that, called Humans Need Not Apply. At the very start of this video, he talks about, I will clear this. At the very start of this video, he talks about how once upon a time,
every human used to have to hunt or gather to survive, but humans are smartly lazy, so we made tools to make our work easier. From sticks to plows to tractors, we've gone from everyone needing to make food to modern agriculture with almost no one needing to make food. And yet, we still have abundance. Of course, it's not just farming, it's everything. We've spent the last several thousand years building tools to reduce physical labor of all kinds. These are mechanical muscles, stronger, more reliable, and more tireless than human muscles ever could be. And that's a good thing. Replacing human labor with mechanical muscles frees people to specialize, and that leaves everyone better off, even those still doing physical labor. This is how economies grow and standards of living rise. Some people have specialized to be programmers and engineers whose job is to build mechanical minds. Just as mechanical muscles made human labor less in demand, so are mechanical minds making human brain labor less in demand.
Okay, so that's the general concept that we're going to look at when we watch this Human Needs Not Apply video. Now, I've shown this to classes in the past, so some of you may have already seen this video, but I think it's important to remember this concept, so that when we talk about automation has been replacing workers for hundreds, if not thousands of years, but now we're getting to a new point where it's no longer muscles that are being replaced, it's now minds that are being replaced. So an easy example of this is the self-checkout. So once upon a time, my wife, when she was going through uni, she worked at Woolworths at the checkout, or maybe Coles, I don't remember. That was a job that people did, whereas that job is increasingly being taken over by the self-checkout. The same way that at McDonald's, it's not that they're firing people, it's just that they're not hiring as many people now that their processes include people being able to order on the boards to order without having to speak to a person. Eventually that system will improve and people will be able to scan a card or wave their phone over and have their pre-preferred meal already sent before they even get there. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something we need to consider. We need to at least be thinking about. So the second half that I talked about was inequality. So can anyone tell me what inequality is?
Something that's not equal.
Excellent. Something that's not equal. So when we talk about wealth inequality, what are we talking about?
Unequal amounts of money.
Unequal amounts of money. That is exactly right. Thank you very much. Now, I've asked you guys, I've given each of you 100 poker chips, or a value of 100 in poker chips, and I've asked you to divide it into 5 groups. Now, to explain that a little bit better, what I'm going to ask you to do now is I'm going to show you this video, and this talks about the disparity between what people think the wealth distribution is and what their ideal wealth distribution. So, in these groups here, each of these colours represents the number of people in so 20% of the population. Now, to explain that a little bit better, this guy said that he doesn't find this chart very good at explaining these values. So what he's going to do instead is he's going to say, imagine...
Make it simple. Here they are.
Imagine the 300 million people, or 311 million people at the time this video was made, people in America. And instead of having 300 million, he's represented by 100 little people. And what he's done is he's lining those people up in terms of their wealth, how much money they have access to. He's lining them up, and then he's going to bracket them into 20 percentile groups, and he's color-coded them. So you can see here, we have the poorest 20%, the richest 20%, here's the middle class, we have the upper middle and the lower middle class. We have five different brackets of wealth. Now, what he's then done is said, imagine all of the wealth in the United States. Now, I'm going to say that Australia is a similar country to the United States in terms of our per capita wealth and spending. Similar. It's not perfect, but it's close enough that we're not going to get this video for Australia because we're a much smaller country. So what he said is, imagine that you took all of that $50 trillion and you divided it equally. This is what that would look like. This would be the distribution of that wealth divided equally. Now, he's referred to that as dreaded socialism, the idea that the wealth is distributed. Now, I don't think that socialism has ever actually achieved that in the few countries that have had a socialist or communist country, but that's not really the point here. He's saying, well, that's okay, that's one extreme. And when I ask you guys, I've asked you guys to divide your $100 up amongst your 5 groups. Now, in any of those groups, did anyone have those 5 piles equal with $20 in each? No. No one does, because most people understand that there are going to be some people who are still at school, they're still at uni, or they're working to get a better career. And there are people on the other side who have worked really hard their whole life providing a valuable service. Maybe they came up with a really great idea, and they should be rewarded for coming up with a great idea or for working really hard. There should be some reward in the system for people who are further along in their career, who have worked hard, who have done jobs that no one else wants to do. So, for example, my attitude is that socialism sounds like a great idea until you have to ask, okay, so who's going to work in the mines? Because people are happy to work in the mines if they're getting paid more than the people who get to sit and write poetry, for instance. So, what we're going to have a look at here is what most people think, on average, what most people think is a fair wealth distribution. So this is what 92% of people, whether or not they're conservative or liberal, if they're on the left or the right-hand side of the political spectrum, most people think this looks about right, with the wealthy having about 10 times as much as the poor. That's what most people think is about fair. And then we still have a healthy middle class, and if we say this line here, about this line here is the poverty line, right? And this, when I say the poverty line, what does that mean? That means that people are something like a $500 fine or a $500 medical bill away from bankruptcy. Right? So the question you can ask this to your parents when you get home, you say, hey, if we had to pay a $500 fine or a $500 medical bill, would we be okay? Now, I imagine in this class, we're a pretty middle class, that I think most of us would be able to go home and tell our parents that, yeah, we'll be okay. But in America, that's not as much the case, but we'll see how this, we talked about what people think is acceptable. We think that it's okay that there are some people who, for some whatever reason, a very small percentage of people who at the moment are doing a bit tough, but I'm sure they'll get back on their feet. Now this is the actual reality. This is the reality of, sorry, we're not even at the reality. This is what people think the reality is. If you ask people instead, and I can actually close this for a second, I'll give you a second to think about this. With your chips that you have in front of you, I want you to reorganize your money now to what you think the wealth inequality in Australia is. I want you to tell me how much you think the poorest 20% of people have and the richest percentage of Australians have. Now, we're going to use American stats, and I will say that in America there is greater wealth inequality than there is in Australia. While I'm doing that, just to buy some time, can anyone tell me what is the difference between Australia and America in terms of our wealth inequality? Yeah?
They don't have like Centrelink.
Okay, that's a good answer. So we have something called Centrelink. So Centrelink is a federally funded organisation that it provides welfare for people who... What kind of people get welfare in Australia? Okay, yep, okay, excellent. So single parents, people who are on disability, people who are low income earning students, so students who aren't earning money, and the unemployed. They're the four main groups. So people with disability, people, so there's consideration for low income earning families, so that's where you talk about single parents, students and the unemployed. So that's one aspect. Another aspect we have in Australia, what happens when you go to Australia here? I'll put it this way, recently, in the last 2 weeks, I think Bob Hawke died. Did anyone remember what one of Bob Hawke's legacies was?
Medicare.
Medicare, exactly right. So Medicare is the idea that when everyone pays 1.5% tax to fund the hospitals. Now, that said, you could still have a severe condition that might cause you to go, if you were to see a specialist, for instance, that you could still have a lot of out-of-pocket. But by and large, there is free healthcare for everyone in Australia to some extent. Okay, so I've given you enough time now.
Already did it.
Those two groups here in the centre, you're both finished? Yeah, well you can work. Okay, so we're going to look at what most people think is acceptable. This is what most people think the situation is. Now at this point, we're now starting to see a much steeper incline. We're seeing that this group here, compared to this group, if you compare the amount of money here, the number of dots here compared to the amount of dots here, it's about 100 to 1. Yeah, if you compare those dots to those dots, it's a substantial increase. But most people think that's what most people think the situation is in the United States at the moment. Now, if you have a look here, these people are below the poverty line. What number of people is below the poverty line based on what people think? It's more than a quarter. It's somewhere about 30% is what most people think is the case. Okay, now what I'm going to look at here is we're going to look at what the actual wealth distribution is. Now, part of this relates to mathematics. So we talked about STEM. Part of this is understanding statistics, that people are very, very bad at visualizing numbers. People are very bad at, when we tell them statistics, am I even playing it? People are very bad at, okay, so the actual wealth distribution looks something more like this. So that we can see here that the wealthy top 2% is 2 to 5% is so high that they're off the graph, and then we're going to see the top 1%. Right? I'm going to skip ahead. That the top 2 to 5%, we actually have to move over to its own column because it's off the scale. The top 1% has so much wealth that we need to create our own pile to show that amount of wealth. This is the top 1% of people. Now, I should point out this is the top 1% of Americans, right? I'm going to talk about global inequality in a second. But the idea here is we'll eventually see that the top 1% of Americans own 40% of the wealth. Then 40% of the nation's wealth is held by 1% of people. Now, in terms of income, now there's a difference between wealth and income. Okay, all of these people, they have 7% between them. All of this group here have 7% between them. Now, in terms of income, that means that for every dollar that's earned, 25 cents goes to the richest 1%. Now, we can talk about whether or not we think this is fair and what we could do to change this. There are things that, the way that we vote, the economic policies we have, will take into account this. I'm not going to focus too much on that, but I will say there's a lot of maths here anyway. And what I think that is a real focus of our subjects, the iSTEM subjects, is the idea that when mathematicians and scientists are very bad at explaining concepts to people, that when they use a standard deviation, when they refer to things by a certain percentage, it's very, very hard for people to visualize what they're talking about. So people can brush away the problem, that they don't worry about the problem because they don't have a true understanding. There's a lot of ways that we can represent information. And I'm sure that there will be people who will watch this video and say, Mr. Punzit is misrepresenting the information. And that's fine. I'm happy for you to come and speak to me and talk about how I may have... that no matter how you represent information, there is always a slant. But I'm trying to say this in as unbiased a way as possible. Now, my concern here is not so much what the wealth inequality is, but it is more than most people are familiar with. Most people do not appreciate how much wealth is held by the richest 1% of Americans or Australians. The situation is surprisingly similar in Australia, but we have a healthier middle class at the moment. But this is something for you guys to be aware that as you start voting, that these are things to be to consider. Okay, now what I want to talk about is in terms of wealth inequality, right? Everyone here is in the top 1% of wealth. If your family is earning more than $35,000 US a year, you are at the top 1% of all humans alive on the planet, right? So I would say that in Australia, given the
$35,000
US dollars. So let's say if your family makes about $50,000 US, you're in the top 1% of all humans. And just to try and show you what that looks like, right? We have places like Burundi where people live on $27 a day. Sorry, I don't think that's a day, that's a year, I think. That's their annual income, right? Whereas when we start getting up to the richest, we can go to the richest families in the world. As we start sliding down, we can start seeing, I think, anyway, I don't remember what the divider is. When I'm looking at the richest, I can get an idea. I didn't see what was Netherlands.
Wait, so like they gain...
Yeah, I think this is monthly income.
Wait, so if they were to say you would gain $50,000, or is it like by working?
So your family income. Your family income. So I'll give you an example. Teachers in Australia start on, I think, somewhere about $60,000 a year. So if one of your parents is a teacher, you are in the top 1% of the global population. I'm thinking this must be monthly income based on looking at the numbers. Okay, so I will say that worldwide, that we have much greater wealth inequality worldwide. The number of people living in adverse poverty worldwide has gone down. What we're seeing is that in developed countries like Australia and America and the United Kingdom, we're seeing more wealth inequality in those countries. Now, one of the things that is a worrying idea is that the only way to reverse this trend is in some sort of catastrophe, a war, a plague, or something along those lines, or a revolution. Hopefully that's not the case, but I just think that you guys should be aware of that. Now, what I want to talk about, you might also say, well, what's the problem? What's the problem? Now, this video here, I'm not going to put this video on because it's a little longer video and a complicated video, but there is a good argument to be made that countries that are more unequal have worse outcomes. Now, there's a couple of things to do with this. For starters, that things like life expectancy and health, the more unequal your country is, and this is measured by something called the Gini index, which is, I believe, spelled like that. The more unequal, so the closer your number is to 1, it's between 0 and 1. Right, so the most equal countries have 2.4, the least equal countries are like 0.9. Right? So most equal countries are countries like Sweden, but also, interestingly, places like Afghanistan are most equal. But not only do we have situations like there's a huge difference in life expectancy based on the inequality of your country, but also if you have an unequal country, it means that the most talented people, the Elon Musks of your country, are not going to go and achieve because they can't get to uni. So if you have someone, if the Tony Stark of your country can't get to uni, he doesn't have the opportunity to ever succeed, to ever be the great leader, the innovator, the entrepreneur that is what going to help your country to realize its maximum growth. Now, how this really relates, I will talk about, is the idea that more and more we're going to have technological skills be in demand. Worldwide, more and more the jobs that are going to be in demand are not going to be low-skilled jobs because those jobs can be more easily automated. Also, traditional business jobs, like working in an office, are more likely to be automated.
There are other reasons inequality is growing. Economists point to something called skill-biased technological change. The jobs created in modernized economies are more technology-based, generally requiring new skills. Workers that have the education and skills to do those jobs thrive, while others are left behind. So in a way, technology's become a complement for skilled workers, but a replacement for many unskilled workers. The end result is an ever-widening gap between not just the poor and the rich, but also the poor and the working class. As economies develop and as manufacturing jobs move overseas, low-skill, low-pay, and high-skill, high-pay work are the only jobs left. People with few skills fall behind in terms of income. In the last 30 years in the US, the number of college-educated people living in poverty has doubled from 3% to 6%, which is bad. And then consider that during the same period of time, the number of people living in poverty with a high school degree has risen from 6% to a whopping 22%. Over the last 50 years, the salary of college graduates has continued to grow, while after adjusting for inflation, high school graduates' incomes have actually dropped. It's a good reason to stay in school. There are other reasons the income gap is widening. The reduced influence of unions, tax policies that favor the wealthy, and the fact that somehow it's okay for CEOs to make salaries many, many times greater than those of their employees. Also, race and gender and other forms of inequality can exacerbate income inequality.
Let's dive into the data for the United States. We'll start by mentioning Max Lorenz, who created a graph to show income inequality. Along the bottom, we have the percent of households from 0 to 100%.
Okay, I'm going to leave that there. I will put links to all these videos so you can go and have a look at them later. I was thinking that would explain the Gini coefficient, but I don't want to go down too far down that rabbit hole. Now, what I'll say is that in this Humans Need Not Apply video, he starts talking about self-driving cars. How self-driving cars are an example. Well, okay, so he talks about this robot Baxter, and he says about robot Baxter, he is 10 times slower, or 1/10 of the speed, but it doesn't matter if you're 1/10 of the speed if you're 1/100th the price. Yeah, because if you're 1/100th the price, it still means that you're going to make 10 times more money. Yeah? If you're 1/10 the speed, but 1/100th the price, you're still 10 times more valuable to the employer. Now, Baxter can do a lot of jobs. He can do a lot of jobs that other people would have done in factories or even things like making coffee. But what they're going to talk about is self-driving cars. Now, we're starting to see the start of self-driving cars. But self-driving cars, vehicles, so things from bus drivers, taxi drivers, truck drivers, and people who work on a variety of other professions, like things like warehouse workers and mine workers, they represent. You got some?
Oh, I was going to say Uber.
Okay, so, well, these people currently represent about 25% of the economy, especially if you consider the service industries that they support, right? Things like service stations on highways or mechanics, right? 25% of the population. Now, what we're starting to see is things like Uber, right? That taxi drivers are already being replaced by Uber and being undercut, so the conditions for Uber are much worse than that of taxis, and they're not regulated the way that taxis were. So that we hear a lot more of particularly women being the subject, or the victims of violent crime as a result of Uber, as an example. But Uber, the company Uber and Lyft, they've said that, well, that they're aiming to replace their drivers with self-driving cars. So those drivers who are currently working for Uber, their recommendation is that they should either learn to become mechanics or learn to code. And so that's where these technical skills are becoming more valuable. I will also argue that mechanics are a job that can be automated. Now, they don't talk about professions, and now I have a better video that talks about the impact on professions, but here he starts talking about lawyers, and how what the job that baby lawyers used to do, junior lawyers, was that they would read through mountains and mountains of paper. Now, robots can read, and they can detect the irregularity better than humans can. So already, I've known people when I finished uni who went into law, and who they struggled to find work because they weren't firing lawyers, they just weren't hiring new lawyers. So now, unless you know someone who's a lawyer, like your dad or your uncle, who can get you a job as a aunt or mother, who can get you a job in a law firm, chances are you're going to struggle to get that first job in law. Similarly, in this video, he talks about medicine. And he talks about the computer machine Watson. And so this computer, it's an artificial intelligence that collates medical information. And already we're starting to see medical professions, doctors, radiologists, hematologists, and surgeons their job is starting to be done more and more accurately and more efficiently by automated systems. So these are professions that are being affected. Also, creative jobs are being affected. So we have automated systems that can
It gets weird fast. What does that even...
They can paint, and we have automated systems that can write music. We have automated systems that can write newspaper articles. And that is increasingly something that people need to be aware of and thinking about, that even creative jobs are going to be done more and more. Now, what I'm going to point out here, this video is a very good video. This is by Kirkazak, and it talks about middle management and how middle management, those sorts of jobs can be done more and more by freelancers. Does anyone know what a freelancer is? Yep.
A contractor, like they just go.
Yeah, that's right, a contractor. Someone who doesn't work for the company long term, they just work for the company for a little while. So what a company can do is they can hire a freelancer to work for them, and a computer system can record all of the work that they're doing. Once that freelancer has finished their contract, the computer system has seen how that freelancer did their job and can reproduce that job after they've left. Okay, now, what I'm going to click on now is we're just going to talk a little bit more about skills.
So much has been written about automation, about demographics, and about inequality separately. But at Bain, what we saw was no one had looked at the confluence of those three important trends and what that confluence will mean for the next 1 to 2 decades. When we looked at that, we started looking at demographics. And what we saw was that the labor force will experience a very steep deceleration. Working longer will help take the edge off, but not enough. All things being equal, that should be good news in terms of inequality as the workforce is smaller, wages rise, and the historically high levels of inequality we have today should abate. But automation, and in particular service sector automation, short circuits that process. In the beginning, the automation wave will feel buoyant. In fact, in the US alone, we expect to see $8 trillion worth of spend on infrastructure to both build and deploy that automation. But underneath that buoyancy is the erosion of jobs. We'll see either jobs being eliminated or jobs that would have been formed that aren't formed, or wages being reduced or capped at the rate at which a worker becomes more expensive than a robot. Ultimately, through this transition, we expect to see as much as 20 to 25% displacement in the workforce and wage suppression for another potentially up to 80% of workers, which leaves all of the benefits of this period going to that top 20% as we define it, which creates even more inequality.
Okay, I'm just going to pause there. So if I go back to this humans need not apply, he talks about here that the Great Depression represented, I'm just trying to find the section where he talks about this, but the Great Depression was where we had 25% of the workforce. Who's heard of the Great Depression? Let's start there. When did it happen? 1930s, between World War I and World War II, right? It was a bad time to be around, right? If you ask your grandparents, maybe they might have, if they didn't grow up in the Great Depression themselves, their parents may have grown up in the Great Depression, and that there's a real tendency not to throw things out because you don't know where the next one is coming from. The idea that you replace things. We don't live in that sort of mindset anymore, but 25% is what it took for there to be a Great Depression. Now, in this other video, we just talked about there's a good prediction that 20 to 25% of the workforce will have their jobs eliminated through automation. Potentially, the stuff that can be easily automated represents about 45% of the workforce. Now, it's easy to say this is a terrible thing, this is a terrible situation, but it could be fantastic. Because this automation is going to create an enormous amount of wealth. It's going to create so much wealth so quickly that it should be very easy to share. But what I'll put to you is that in the case of Uber, if we look at Uber, so at the moment when Uber makes money, that money is divided amongst Uber and the drivers. Yeah? But when they start replacing those drivers with self-driving cars, where is that wealth going to go? Where is it? It's going to go entirely to Uber. Right? So whoever buys the robots and can afford to buy the robots first is going to have the engine to keep making more and more money, and there's no real reason that they have to give any to anyone else. So, has anyone ever heard of Bill Gates?
Yes.
Who's Bill Gates? He was the creator of Microsoft, one of the richest people in the world, and certainly someone who understands technology. I should also say that Bill Gates, I've seen articles that talk about how Bill Gates has saved more lives than Batman. Now, obviously, Batman's a fictional character, but even if Batman wasn't a fictional character, Bill Gates' work on and his wife's work on malaria prevention has probably saved more lives than the fictional character of Batman. Anyway, the point is that Bill Gates has talked about how we need to make sure that when Uber starts making all of this money, huge amounts of money through automation, and when we talk about creating wealth, it's a bit of an abstract concept. And when we talk about how we make money, how does money come into the system? The idea is that when we can have more stuff more easily, when we have robots that can produce 10 times as much stuff as we can at the moment, that's effectively an increase in global wealth of 10 times. The problem is at this point, there's no requirement for those companies that see and realize that wealth to share any of that wealth. So what we could see is Great Depression levels of employment. Or if we can introduce policies, and this is where I want you to try and understand that STEM and STEM subjects are not just about numbers. They're also about the social and the social implications, the ethical implications, the environmental implications, the cultural implications of what we produce and what those technologies achieve. And the fact is that you guys are going to be the people who direct that change. People who go into technology are going to be the people who make that change. And if we leave it to only some groups of people in society to go into these fields, we're not going to have all of humanity represented. It's important that we try and get everybody represented in our technological decisions and to a degree our policy decisions. And it's important that policy decisions are based on science and maths. That when we make these policy decisions, we're basing it on an actual understanding of our numbers, of our data that we have. Because you can't fix problems if you can't measure them. You can't fix problems if you don't understand what's going on. And so sometimes we have to break these things down into a way that we can visualize more easily. Right? Sometimes we need to take our numbers on things like climate change and be able to interpret it in such a way that people are going to understand what you're what you're telling them. Okay. So. The last thing I will I will let this woman finish because I think
This sounds scary, and it is scary. The last time we saw a transition of this magnitude was agriculture to industry that took place over about 40 years, was twice as long and half of the impact that we expect to see in the next 20-year period. Of course, there is some good news. At the end of a period of transition like that, the quality of life is improved by unimaginable amounts. Welfare is improved, and we have new industries and new opportunities. But in the meantime, during that transition period, businesses, governments, workers, and investors need to prepare themselves for a future that's older and more automated.
Okay, so going back to this last video, the Kierkegaard at the end of this video starts talking about, and we talk about new graduates, about how people are working more hours for less pay, and how there just simply aren't enough jobs for the new people
Graduates are forced.
who are entering the workforce. The idea that it's going to be harder and harder, and there's going to be more and more demand for those employees, that they're going to have more and more skills just to get any sort of job. Now, what their conclusion is that the solution here is, like I said, there could be so much wealth, there's plenty to share. And generally the idea that people talk about here is they talk about something called UBI, Universal Basic Income. Now, this is not to say that this is the solution. This is not to say that this is the only way that this change is not going to be a disaster for everyone. But it's a suggestion a lot of people have put a lot of thought into. The idea is universal basic income is a system where everyone gets a certain amount of money that is produced from this growing automation. That everyone gets a baseline amount of money that they don't need to live in poverty. Now, you could still work, because there'll still be some demand for some work, and those people will make more money as a result of doing jobs that are in demand and the skills that people want. And for instance, if you have a great restaurant and people want to come to your restaurant because they want the experience, then people can spend some of that income that they receive and you will benefit from it. You will have a better quality of life. But it also means that some people who just want to donate their time for things that they feel passionately about, so for instance people who feel really passionate about nature might have the opportunity to dedicate their time, their livelihood, to working on their hobbies or interests, or making the world better through volunteering. So there's a lot of content there. I will provide links to that. I hope that you find that somewhat worthwhile. Like I said, I have 4 more lessons that I plan on talking about. So I have biomedical innovation, so this is where we talk about things like prosthetics and self-driving wheelchairs. We talk about game theory, where we talk about things like the prisoner's dilemma and how people often don't make the best choices for themselves. So we talk about other fallacies for instance, things like the sunk cost fallacy. We're going to talk about encryption, and one other topic, but I can't remember. Anyway, thank you very much.